and welcome to our panel session on payments modernization is great, but what about the fraud risk? I've got two amazing panelists with me today. And as we know, Canada is well down its payments modernization path and has done a fabulous job at looking at lessons learned from around the world in terms of what impact real-time payments has had into the financial system. But as the real-time rails becomes closer to and more into adoption into Canada, it's even more critical to think about the fraud considerations that brings. But I'd like to firstly introduce the panel that I've got with me. So Dondi, did you want to introduce yourself first?
Thanks, Dave. Happy to. Hello, everyone. I am Dondi Black. I am the head of products at TSYS Issuing, and I'm very happy to be joining Shane and Dave today and having this conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Dondi. And Shane, did you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. I'm Shane Kerplan. I'm the Associate Vice President of Global Payments and Risk Solutions at Central One. And again, I'm really pleased to be here, happy to be participating, and grateful to be asked.
And just a quick introduction for myself. So I'm Dave Excell. I'm the founder of Featurespace, and we provide enterprise fraud and risk management solutions. But I guess less from me and more from our amazing guests, who represent a huge amount of expertise in managing fraud and risk in real time in digital ecosystems. So maybe to get started, as we think about real-time payments and as they're added into the digital payment mix within the market, what are some of the major fraud risks that need to be considered? And maybe Dondi, do you want to go first?
Happy to. I think one of the things that we're talking a lot more about these days are the authorized push payment fraud. And so this is where we see fraudsters using their wiles to go out and really target unsuspecting customers. That's through scams as well as through phishing attacks. And so, we're seeing a pretty dramatic rise there. And we've seen a lot of this playing out in the UK first and foremost. But we would all be remiss if we didn't kind of take some global lessons learned from what we see playing out there. But I think, overall, the rise of new digital payment types, it's really created kind of a new landscape as you think about the challenge and the opportunity for issuers to think about, how they're going to not only, create that balance between enabling all of those new types of form factors and payment acceptance and issuance and capability, but balancing that with all of the nuances that you have to have in terms of kind of how you protect that information stream that goes along with that transaction as all that data is in transit. And so, I think we're seeing some really incredible innovations emerge as well in terms of as we're seeing these things play out and we're seeing the fraudsters adapt, we're also seeing some incredible innovations and adaptations coming along in terms of how we are leveraging the data and the insights that we have in that authorization flow in that transaction event. But really seeing issuers stepping up and pairing that and adding some nuance to their fraud management strategy and their risk management strategy in terms of, expanding even the reach of their cyber protection tools to enable things like, synthetic identity detection and things like, monitoring for more emailage attacks and those types of scams that are more prevalent. But these are some of the things that I would say we're really seeing. And it certainly created some challenges in terms of institutions for how they want to not only connect to enable those incredible experiences, but ultimately that connection is only as good as their ability to protect that relationship and protect all of the value that client has entrusted with them. So I would say, that's a lot of what we're seeing really picking up at scale at this phase.
Great. Well, thank you, Dondi. And I guess, Shane, what are you seeing?
Well, I think that the rising digital payment transaction volumes is really something that needs to be considered by every financial institution. A recent survey from Payments Canada showed that 43% of Canadians have indicated a permanent move to digital channels since the pandemic. So due to this change in customer behavior from the pandemic, and of course, there's always the push from financial institutions to have their customers use digital channels, we're seeing more and more customers use digital. And some of them are quite new to it and not savvy to how fraud occurs in the digital realm. And further, of course, the move to digital channels is a move to real-time payments, faster payments. Another survey by TransUnion reports that attempted fraud on digital channels for financial sector has increased in Canada by 218%, comparing the last 4 months of 2020 to the first 4 months of 2021. So here you have a higher number of digital transactions, an increase in clients that may not be as comfortable or familiar with how to protect themselves in the digital channel, and you mix that with real-time payments, and you really have a hunting ground that's ripe for fraudsters to try to attack on. But we talk a lot about real-time channels, and that's important. But what we need to recognize also that fraudsters will move to the path of least resistance, and so you always got to keep an eye on all the channels. And so really, what you want to do is you want to have a solution that's multi-channel and looking across a variety of different payment types. And so monitoring those multiple channels allows for a bigger picture look. It allows you to detect anomalous behavior, and also looking for linked transactions between the rapid intake of and exit of funds from a particular account. Could be an indicator of a mule account or an account takeover. But it's a technology-based solution that allows you to take into account those multiple channels, allows you to design rules that are targeted to specific fraud typologies. And of course, your artificial intelligence, machine learning, all those things factor in to look across all those channels so that while you got your eye on the ball for real time, you're not ignoring the other pieces of the puzzle that fraudsters will naturally move to if you're effective in controlling fraud on the real-time channel.
And I think, Shane, one of the things that I think is interesting, if we think about how fraud has been prevented in the past, it's usually been relatively focused on single channels and looking at those in isolation. And now when we think about real-time payments and the speed at which money can move, that's no longer the best way in terms of how an institution needs to look across channels and think holistically around what are the access points that a consumer or a business has to their bank account.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially when you look at the potential opportunities they have to exploit the gaps between each of those opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah, or they'll mix channels. They'll move it in through one and then exit it rapidly through a real-time channel. And so if you're looking at all the different pieces in conjunction with each other, it provides a much higher degree of protection.
That's right.
No, definitely. So TSYS and Central One both provide payment services to multiple financial institutions, which has a fantastic benefit of looking across an entire market. And how does this help you think about protecting real-time payments? And perhaps, Shane, we can start with you this time.
Yeah, sure. I think that the one benefit is that, you take a look at Central One as an entity, and we provide payment services to over 200 financial institutions in Canada. And, often fraudsters, when they're trying to obfuscate their funds and prevent recovery, they're moving those funds from financial institution to financial institution. So certainly one of the benefits that Central One brings to the table for our client base is because we're tied into so many financial institutions, we can often see both sides of the transaction, the origination and the completion. And so, for example, if we're looking at transactions that are originated that are viewed as higher risk and they terminate with another of our clients at an individual account, that could be a very indicator that that's a mule account or an account takeover. And so it allows the technology to zero in on that particular element and show that there's smoke so that you can go and check if there's fire, and also lock down those transactions to give an opportunity to examine whether they're legitimate or not. And, basically that ability to evaluate both sides of the transactions is very important. But in addition to that, it also, because we're collecting data from so many financial institutions, you have a consortium view that lends tremendous value to the ability to analyze and take advantage of machine learning and artificial intelligence.
No, fantastic, Shane. And I guess, Dondi, and what have you seen from the TSYS network?
I would say, similar to Shane, TSYS is interestingly today, we are a global payments company. And so we likewise have a line of sight and a fairly wide perspective and lens through which to kind of look at transaction activity that's taking place globally, both on the merchant acquiring side as well as on the issuing side. And so I think that line of sight really puts us in a really unique position in order to identify, large scale attacks, scheme attacks. And that's increasingly important. We've talked a little bit, you both touched on before, this expansion in terms of, channels of acceptance and the almost multiplier effect that can have when we talk about some of these large scale attacks and how those are being carried out. And today, the reality is we are in a very modern and increasingly open system. And so making sure that we're focused on building resilience into kind of our solutions and how we deploy that line of sight is critical. I mean, that's essential. And then the other thing I would say is making sure that we are in a position to leverage our technology in order to model for that good behavior. And so, increasingly, we said before, I think we used the term wily, that these fraudsters are wily as far as how they, carry out some of these scams and these attacks. And the reality is, banks are in a position, they know their customers really well, and they are trusted to know their customers really, really well. And so, I think it's increasingly important. And the difference is, solutions and technologies that base kind of that fraud scoring mechanism on modeling that good behavior. What is normal for Dave? What is normal for Shane? What is the channel that they prefer to use? Increasingly, how do you layer and supplement things like, layering authentication, for example, in order to kind of improve that. But that adaptation that's really based on positive, good behavior really helps sometimes those negative things stand out and come to the forefront much more quickly so that you can respond and manage those effectively.
No, definitely. And it seems to be every other day there's the news of a data breach, which often then goes into the hands of the fraudsters. So
that's right.
Where we can utilize data to our own advantage to prevent the fraud attacks is definitely of value.
Well, and I would also say, I think, and this came to mind, Shane, when you were speaking before, you talked about them entering one channel and maybe exiting another. And I think that ability to work across channels is critically important because so there's all those channels, all those points of potential compromise that all have to be looked at through one single lens, but also managed in a very bespoke fashion sometime. And I know one of the things that we see as we talk about large scale attacks, and is that sometimes we see, channels of upgrade as we all saw going through this digital transformation, the acceleration of that over the last 2 years. We saw a lot of issuers out there, working to put in upgrades at an incredibly accelerated pace to ensure that continuity of experience and access for their cardholders. And one of the other things that we saw in terms of scam activities carried out is very, very often they're targeting those systems and those platforms when they're at a vulnerable point, meaning when they're being at that point where they're being upgraded, updated. And so the ability to weed out not only the positive behavior of the customers, but also protect the integrity of that infrastructure around all those channels as you're doing all of those upgrades is critically important.
Now, I guess, Shane, one of the questions I'd be interested in is, have you seen many concerns from customers about their data being used in a consortium to be able to look at fraud and look at risk?
That's a great question, Dave, because obviously having good controls over data for financial institutions is paramount. It's always the forefront of everybody's mind, and it is very important to us as well. And we certainly, when we're interacting and discussing this with our clients, 100% are always asking the questions about what's done to protect the data, how is data access managed. And so having good governance procedures and policies in place and the right security protocols is paramount. But we haven't had any of our clients indicate a concern. They see the value that's coming to the table from a consortium view, and the ability to better protect their clients and their book as well. And so we've had a very positive and supportive response from that perspective, but with appropriate checking, examination, and discussion would be the best way to describe it.
No, that's great. And I think that the benefit that's there in terms of understanding all of those nuances between what is really genuine and the variety of behaviors that good customers can legitimately have versus trying to exploit the differences that the fraudsters do, it's important to have that data and up-to-date data too.
Yeah.
And so Shane, what is Central One doing to support your credit unions as you look to provide secure transactions on the new real-time rails as they go live?
Well, I think the key thing that we've been driving from a message, and I shouldn't say I know the key message that we've been delivering to our credit unions, and we've been very consistent, is that fraud management is a multi-layer approach. Technology in the form of a fraud detection platform is absolutely a key component to an overall strategy, but it needs to work in conjunction with all the different layers that can be applied to mitigate fraud. Good guarding of your front door, excellent KYC, two-step authentication, strong security protocols, looking to establish individual limits on transactions for individual customers, training of your frontline staff, customer education. All of these things layer on top of each other to create a proper response for fraud management, and our customers have been very responsive to that message. Central One's primary role is to enable that technology solution, to provide the benefit of consortium data that I talked about previously, and basically leveraging the inputs from a multitude of financial institutions within our network, and that helps to protect our clients and their customers. But in addition to that, Central One is also in the position to gain insights by seeing how the ecosystem is evolving across all those financial institutions, and providing those insights back to our credit unions to help them continue to evolve their multi-layer approach and help them to adapt as fraudsters shift their methods to different attempts to commit fraud.
No, definitely. And I think the move to like real-time payments shifts the operational process that happens within an institution, and also the way in which we communicate to customers. Like when they click on the button to transfer money, it's gone. There's not that opportunity to go back and stop the payments from going through.
Yeah, recovery efforts are extremely difficult when you're talking about a real-time environment. And so the focus needs to be on preventing as opposed to recovering.
No, definitely. Yeah, and especially because there can be multiple hops that the fraudster will use to move the money out of the system extremely quickly.
Absolutely.
So I guess like we're touching on that with the instant movements of funds. So I guess what other elements of payment and the fraud prevention needs to become real time to make sure that we do provide a great customer experience? Because the last thing that we want to do is invest into all of this infrastructure and do the education, and then the first time, especially in this day and age, if something doesn't work the first time, often a customer will be turned off and it's hard to recover. So I guess, Dondi, what have you seen in terms of making sure that experience is positive straight off the bat?
Well, again, getting that balance between managing that risk and delivering a great experience is the key. And if anything, that we've kind of seen, it's that we recognize today that, putting a spotlight on the significance of self-learning technologies, like we've talked about a little bit here already, and the intrinsic ability that they had to work really in real time in order to analyze an entire payment journey, because as we said, it's all starting to happen in real time, and then accurately, distinguishing those behaviors. I'll go back to, what is real, genuine, authentic, and versus what is fraud. So I think the ability to recognize those subtle nuances between a genuine interaction and something that's really an anomaly in real time is really kind of one of the groundbreaking places that we've seen machine learning and AI powered technology really kind of step up and rise to the forefront in terms of how we're combating fraud. When you remove all the latency from a payment transaction activity. I mean, before we've talked about machine learning, we've seen AI in use in different fraud models and technologies and solutions, but there was always a little bit of a lag effect. And so the fact that we're seeing that really kind of adapting in real time and pick up on those nuances and those contexts that really can be so nuanced that they're at that card holder level. I think that's really powerful, just seeing that application come to the forefront today. And then the other thing that I would say, underscores how it's adapting in real time to support the speed that we're seeing today is authentication and authorizations. The advances that we've seen there in terms of two-way communication, verifications with customers. I think we've seen some kind of leapfrog in terms of how some of those capabilities have stepped up and enabled that seamless experience that really is the promise and the expectation of cardholders.
No, definitely. And that, like, some of the experience that we've had in terms of when you do start to introduce that additional sort of authorization into the transaction, it becomes the expectation. And there's always that balance between the additional levels of security where customers feel like it is safe versus almost sometimes having too much speed and customers wanting that seatbelt around them when they're driving down the Ferrari down the motorway to be safe when they're making those transactions.
Yeah, it really is about introducing the right amount of friction at the right time for the right transactions, because, I think probably all of us can relate. We've all had some kind of a personal experience, and, it doesn't always have to be a negative experience. I had an occasion in December where I was sitting in a live theater getting ready to watch a play, and I got a notification on my phone of a fuel purchase. Did I authorize it? And there was enough information with my issue where that they knew that wasn't a zip code that I was in, that wasn't a way that that wasn't a transaction I typically used that particular card for, and it alerted me. And I immediately had the opportunity to say, no, that's not me. And in real time, the transaction was blocked and a new card was issued. And by the time I exited the play, I had a tracking number for my new card that was on the way, and they had already provisioned a new digital card to my mobile wallet. So when you think about, as an issuer, how do you maintain the integrity of these great experiences and great service? Fraud isn't always a negative. It can be an opportunity done the right way, handled the right amount of friction at the right time and place can actually do a lot to reinforce that trust that relationship is really built upon.
Yeah, it's always turning that crisis into an opportunity, isn't it? And show how well you can respond and pick up to that. And I remember when we were working with some of our merchants in Europe when 3D Secure was introduced, and often that was seen as a burden, a friction into the payment experience. And we were able to work with that merchant to, when we started to trust and know who the customer was, we were looking to reduce that friction and remove the 3D Secure step. And their customers actually took that negatively as they started to feel like the transaction was no longer as safe, even though you were trying to make it simpler for them to be able to make that purchase. Shane, I'd be interested in your perspective as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, building on what Dondi and yourself has said, accurate fraud decision is not only key to stopping fraud, it's imperative when you consider the customer experience. Every customer is going to be enthused if they have an experience like what Dondi had. With regards to your credit card and that compromise, that they're going to clap, they're going to be very happy about it, but they're going to be less enthused if a legitimate transaction is stopped, especially if that transaction is critical. And so bad decisioning by a fraud engine can create significant customer friction, and that's why you need to be constantly monitoring your false positive rates, what your caught fraud is, so you can continuously tune and adjust and look to your modeling to effectively minimize that negative customer impact and create the right level of friction, as Dondi indicated, to both balance controlling fraud losses and maintaining a positive customer experience. This does become more difficult with new payment types because all new behaviors with a brand new payment type are anomalous. And so you've got to do the best you can in forecasting what type of fraud typologies you're going to see, and proactively build rules and approaches to help to mitigate. And again, looking for any experiences that are within industry can be helpful in doing that. But realistically, we're talking about rapid movement of funds. Your technology solution that you employ to evaluate those fraud transactions needs to be able to take into consideration very quickly a whole variety of data elements that's going to provide an overall risk evaluation on a per transaction basis. And so your fraud system should be able to plug into a variety of data sources, looking for things like device information, IP address, customer behaviors, scores from other risk engines like what's provided from Interact. And at the same time, you have to have the confidence that your model and your rules are going to look for those patterns that are not easy to detect, and utilize AI and ML, as well as utilizing the rules that are based upon known fraud approaches. And all of those things combined hopefully are going to generate a system that creates the right amount of friction and a low false positive rate and a high catch rate.
No, definitely. And in that sort of experience, like early on, is just so important in terms of making sure that, yeah, that adoption continues to go through and trust remains in the system as it continues to go through. So I guess like real-time payments has been introduced into different markets around the world. And I guess that there's some lessons that can be learned around where things have worked well and not so well around the world that we can start to like think about how that then comes into Canada and also into the approach that is looking at Central One. So I guess, Dondi, what's some of the experience that you've seen internationally?
I look to UK and I when we began our conversation today, we talked about the authorized push payments, and as you kind of look at the journey that real time faster payments have been on globally. I think there are many jurisdictions around the world that kind of took their cues on what to expect and what to prepare for by looking to the UK first. And so, but I think there's no question that as we have looked at that as kind of a little bit of a test bed and a learning ground for some of this, we've seen quite an uptick and continue to see quite an uptick in terms of scams, whether those are phishing scams or different ones. But I think I think we're starting to see, and we actually touched on this. I think Shane mentioned it, and Dave, you actually queued this up as well. I think that one of the ways that we're seeing that begin to be combated very effectively, and there's some models that are coming out of the UK, for example, that we all need to kind of contemplate and ingest, is focusing on collaboration. We talked about consortiums, and I think this is one of those areas where look, we're all in this together, and the business that we have all chosen to be in is a business of risk at the end of the day. And there's enough opportunity to go around, and so when it comes to sharing the information, because it all comes down to we talked about modeling good behavior. What looked normal for me on my card holder? There were attributes of that transaction, and any of us who have experienced fraud, you can probably go talk to your card issuer, and they will be able to tell you exactly what were the things that they picked up on that flagged this for them, what looked unusual. And so I think that we see issuers being in a really unique place today, where we're seeing them start to kind of harness that information and say, these are the things that we picked up on that we know were unusual, and we're seeing those. And then they're able to partner not only with each other institutions and issuers, but processors, gateways, retail groups, consortiums, different consortium models, to say, what are those larger signals that are being picked up on in the ecosystem at large? And how do we pull those together in order to identify some net new opportunities, increasingly in real time, right? So that's the key that we're talking about today. And so I think that, harnessing the collective power of contributing and being part of these consortiums, so that we can use that information to feed into our machine learning platforms that are powering so much of what we're doing to really drive the real-time benefit of these various solutions that we've kind of touched on today. I think that's the key. Truly getting down to those data-driven insights. I think that's probably what we're seeing evolve, and we're seeing some great use cases that are taking place outside of the UK and just the EU in general, that are translating, and we're starting to see those be adapted into some other sectors and geographies. And I'm sure you and Shane have probably seen some of that as well.
No, and being Australian by birth, one of the things I guess potentially least proud of is if you look at the fraud rates that came about in Australia with the introduction of real-time payments, is the actual fraud losses with the same dollar value that was experienced in the UK recently, although we've got 1/3 the population. So if you look at the value of the fraud that's taking place, has been enormous. But I do think there's a lot that can be learned from the UK. So one of the things that was introduced was the confirmation of payee, so that when you were introducing the account number that you were looking to make that payment through, it was then presenting information about like the name of that account. But it did introduce one of those challenges of not having a national identity to actually make sure that that data was verifiably correct versus being set up by the fraudster to perpetrate the underlying scam that they're looking to take through. And I also think one of the other really important things to consider from identifying those types of scams that have taken place is it's not just around protecting the payment itself, it's looking at what was the activity that led up to the payment. Can we look at how a new payee was entered, looking at the behavior that took place before that to try to understand, was the consumer potentially vulnerable at the time? Were they under duress in terms of the payment? And how could we potentially pick up on signals that were taking place from that? So I guess, Shane, you've been lucky in terms of, in some sense, being able to see the mistakes that have happened elsewhere around the world. And what have you sort of learned from those and being able to pick up into your strategy?
Yeah, well, David, you hit on a key point, what you just said with regards to looking at the underlying elements of a fraud and how it occurred and what was seen in these jurisdictions. And Central One has been very active in trying to gather as much data as possible. I mentioned previously the idea that when you have a brand new payment type hitting the rails, you have no history. So it's very difficult to build a machine learning AI model or what have you that is going to take into account transactions that haven't existed up until that point. And so what Central One has done is we've taken a look at what other jurisdictions have done, not only around the technology, but also around the different layers. But we've tried to drill down and look at the typologies of the fraud that were seen on the introduction of these elements and are working those into our strategy to help control against fraud losses and support our customers. But to your point, we're fortunate in that we were able to look across and see what mistakes others have made and learn from them, but also to look at what they did to fix those and to look at what successes they have had and to leverage those as well. So, it's really both sides of the coin. You learn from the mistakes, but you also learn from the things that went well. And, we're very, very fortunate to be having people that we are able to share with and have been very forthright and provided us with a lot of really good, solid information.
Yeah. Unfortunately, those countries have probably also taught the fraudsters how to be more sophisticated as well. So there's a double-edged sword there.
Apparently, according to Dave, they all came from Australia too, Shane.
But you'll always go back into the cycle. You plug one hole and they find another.
That's right.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about real-time payments, but actually making decisions in real time, given the volume of data and the time that you actually have, which is often measured in milliseconds. What are some of the challenges in achieving that? I guess, Dondi, it'd be good to sort of see how you've been able to do that at TSYS.
So I'll pick up on where Shane left off. He said, that there's always another one, and they find another way, and that's the key. So I think the greatest challenge is, when I think about not just TSYS, but our clients and what we see, what we hear, what are those pain points that we're kind of coming in and looking to address? I think the greatest challenge is just the velocity, the scale. I mean, we've seen in the last 2 years this rise of digital payments at a velocity that is just really unprecedented. We've seen people move into making e-commerce payments that never paid that way before. And similar to what Shane said, there's no history. So if you think about that new behavior and there's no history built there to model that on, the rate of things that kind of come through at any point in time. And the reality is, the issuers are challenged with bandwidth. How do they support that volume and that scale and make the decisions that they need to make? And especially when obviously there's a component of that says, there's models in place and they're going to use those models in an assisted fashion in order to manage as much of that in real time, near real time as they can. But the reality is, in some cases, that pace is just more than they have the bandwidth to consume. And so I'll go back to, I think maybe not that's the challenge. I think the opportunity that we have as an industry is really in, and we talked about this before, the beauty of using not only machine learning, but enabling that to really kind of drive real time. And increasingly, that means in more of an unassisted fashion, but in the ability for that to actually update those models in real time and be building. As that history is building, the model is perfecting itself continuously, because the net impact of that is that the limited resources that we have If you think about it, most issuers in their shop, the people that are actually having to really take the time to do those investigation, you have the ability to actually scale that and let them do a more effective and a better job, because they're focusing on those things that really are nuanced enough that they need that additional look. And so I think the challenge is just the scale, the volume, the velocity, and the pace that we're seeing, and these new kind of payment form factors entering the stream. But the opportunity is to leverage that machine learning in more of a kind of an automated fashion to inform and be building and perfecting those models in real time, so that the capacity that we do have is really channeled exactly where we need it to be channeled. It removes the friction. And I'll go back to, some of Shane's points earlier. That ultimately is how you not only catch more true fraud, but that's also how you reduce those false positives in real time. And so you keep that continuity of that experience for that client, that they really have come to need and depend on, because there's a person who's trying to do something that's important to them, to their family, for their life, to keep it going. And so your ability to remove friction, protect them, and let them carry on is probably that's the wow experience that that we all strive for.
And I guess also real time also means 24/7. So it's around the clock. So it has a huge impact into operations as well. So to having a system that you can rely on to protect yourself while you're getting some well-deserved rest at night is also really important to the operational flow within the banks.
Yeah, it's increasingly, the authorization piece of this that's not new. We've been living in a world where that's been real time or near real time, but for the settlement and the reconciliation of that to now becoming in near real time, that's a game changer. And you're right, the operational impact of that is material. And so having that intuitive intelligence that's kind of always on, always running, always learning, that's the game changer.
Yeah.
Yep, agreed.
So I guess as we look at real-time rails going live in Canada, and I guess to start off with you, Shane, what's the one piece of advice that you'd give to Canadian institutions to best prepare themselves and to be able to prevent fraud as part of this payment modernization journey?
Well, I've said it already, and I'll say it again. It's a multi-layer approach. You cannot put all your eggs in one basket. There's no single silver bullet. And you need to recognize that fraudsters are going to work to defeat any particular layer that catches them. And they're going to keep working at it till eventually they find a way around it. And then that's when the next layer comes into play. And then the next layer, and then the next layer. And then finally, when a fraudulent transaction does get through, which it will eventually, being able to identify that it was fraudulent, and then having a solution in place that catalogs and analyzes that transaction, strengthening the enterprise fraud management detection, and then locking down those transactions again for the future and preventing those from going through. But then, of course, the cycle will start all over again, and you'll end up with a fraudster trying to achieve it through different channels. And so I just speak to the importance of having that multi-layer approach, and also constantly being in a frame of mind to refine and adjust and adapt to the changing patterns that fraudsters are going to attempt to get what they want.
Great. Well, thanks, Shane. And Dondi, what advice would you provide?
Well, I mean, Shane he hit the big one, but I will say, if there's anything that we know, and as we've talked about scams, that we're seeing the rise there, we're seeing synthetic identity really translating to account takeover, fraud. And so as we see that rise, if there's anything that highlights, it's what we already know, and that's that the criminals are incredibly skilled at mimicking genuine customers and using that ability to go ultimately breach systems that are really designed to keep them out. And so I think, without that capability to continuously recognize and reset that baseline behavior and then adapt to those changes, I think, without that, we see fraud detection systems becoming less effective and less efficient. And so, I would echo that layered approach and just say that I think, astute issuers will double down on one of those layers. Really has to be an enablement of this adaptive behavioral analytics and layering that with multi forms of biometrics for authentication on the front end, both behavioral and physical. And so I echo what Shane said. It's the layering, but make sure one of those layers is that adaptive behavioral analytics so that that model is continually building in real time, going back to in the absence of a history as new form factors are being introduced and new channels for acceptance are being kind of added to what's in the quiver for each of your cardholders. That is going to be the essential thing that allows an issuer to really maintain the experience, the trust that they have established with their cardholders.
No, and I also think that what's really important is collaboration as well, is for all of the financial industry to work together, especially through forums that both Central One and TSYS create together to share that knowledge, because it's only it's the weakest link which then creates the opportunity for the fraudster. So as an industry where we can all do better, where we can all be agile and we can all learn from each other, provides a much better platform for us to make financial crime harder to perpetrate, so that we take it out of our financial system as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Dave. And fraudsters have an uncanny ability to find that weak link.
Yeah. And you better believe they have consortiums of their own. You know, they're sharing. They have no qualms sharing information with each other, and when they exploit one link, they're sharing that. So if they're going to be in a consortium model, we should as well. So
Absolutely.
And I think then it's being open and honest. Like, I think everyone's had an experience that they wish they hadn't been. So being able to share that and being open about it is extremely important. I guess we should wrap up here, but I wanted to thank you both, Shane and Dondi, for the fabulous panel. And I hope that everyone's learned a lot from the time that we've had together.
So thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Absolutely. It's been great. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
You bet.